Hello, Iain Dale. Very happy to have you on the Therapy Works podcast.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. At least I think I am.
Until you get unhappy.
Yeah.
You can kind of fill in the gaps, because I always find this thing of giving people their roles is both useful, but also very much not the whole person. So, I mean, you're incredibly productive, so maybe we can talk about that. But you're a broadcaster and an author. You've edited or compiled over 40 books. You're a political commentator, a former publisher and book retailer. You kind of tried for Parliament for a while. And there's the whole side of your private life, which I hope we're going to talk about too. But when you hear that list, does that describe you as you know you or not?
So I'm 62 years old, which I suppose is old enough to look back on your life and try and assess what you've done, what you've achieved, what you failed at. I spend an awfully long time doing that. And I'm not sure it's very productive if one does. Look, I'm mostly known for my radio show. So I think
LBC.
yeah, and that's it's the best job I've ever had. It's what I think has probably defined me more than anything else.
Do you want to talk about the sort of challenges of having a public role and kind of being on the radio? Is it every day? It's 5 days a week, right?
No, it's 4 days a week. I used to do 5. I now do Monday to Thursday. And Friday is supposed to be a day off, but I usually fill it up with things like this, for example.
Yeah.
Or I go and speak at literary festivals or go and speak in schools. So it's very rare that I actually have a Friday off. But I decided in 2018, I'd spent 5 years presenting the Drive Time programme. And I then went back to doing the evenings. And part of the bargain of doing the evenings was that I would do 4 days a week. And I've actually really enjoyed doing that. I did do 5 days a week going up to the election again. It made me realise how much I enjoyed doing 4 days. I love doing the show, but I know that the time will come when maybe I don't. And that will be when I know that it's time to go. But at the moment, I still love doing it. I've been doing it for 14 years.
And what do you love? I was thinking of sort of Zoe Ball when I was thinking about you. Like, she had this very prominent role. Just recently, she stepped down from her BBC Two job. Is it very intense, I imagine?
Well, it can be. I think if you're presenting the breakfast show on any radio station, that is much more of a challenge than anything else, because you know that people generally only listen to about 20 minutes. So you've got the bosses upstairs wanting the figures to show, well, this quarter it's 20 minutes. Next quarter, your target is to get them to listen for 22 minutes and then 25 minutes.
Oh,
it's a bit more relaxed in the evenings. And also getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning or whenever you have to, I mean, it does terrible things to your metabolism.
Sleep, yeah.
And I've done the breakfast show on LBC when Nick Ferrari's been on holiday quite a few times. And even though I enjoyed doing it, I would not want to do it every day. It really does affect your health, I think. Now, Nick's done it for 21 years, so he's got the constitution of an ox. I know that if I ever had done it, it would have been for a year or two. But I mean, there are pressures, because last night, we're recording this on the day of the assisted dying bill going through. They've just announced it's passed. I did 3 hours, my whole show on that subject last night. And I love doing emotional phone-ins, because you're going to get the most brilliant stories from your listeners.
Real deal.
And we really did last night. And we had a debate with somebody from Caring Not Killing, and then someone else from Dignity in Dying, and it was exactly the kind of debate you want. There was no histrionics, there was no shouting, they treated each other with respect, and I just thought at the end of it, that's how all debates should be. So there are pressures.
It's very meaningful.
Yeah, and you do become a bit of a public figure. I do get people stopping me in the street. Taxi drivers recognise me by my voice more than my face, I think. And it happens more and more. The longer you do it, the more it happens. And I'm not going to say I don't enjoy it, but I'm never quite sure what to say beyond thanks for listening or something particularly inane.
I guess what I get from what you're saying is that, you know, we all do want to be seen. As a child, it's a basic need. You want to be seen, and you want attention, and you want to matter. And sometimes people in public roles, the neglect that they had as a child is the source of where they want their attention to matter and to be seen because it was so absent as a child.
Well, I mean, in that case, I'm the opposite of that, because I had all the love that you could want from parents as a child. I had a perfect childhood.
Really? I've never heard anyone say they had a perfect
well,
childhood.
I absolutely did. I can't
Wow.
think of anything about my childhood that I could complain about. So by that logic, I should be the biggest recluse in the country. There is a little bit of that in me, in that I don't like going to lots of big sort of celebrity parties, for example. My nightmare is to walk into a room where there are 100 people and I don't know any of them, and I have to make small talk with them. I hate that sort of thing. So I've got this sort of inner shyness, which people always laugh when you say, well, you're a broadcaster. You speak to the nation every evening. Well, I do, but I just got a microphone in front of me. I don't have an imaginary person that I'm speaking to. But I'm not a sort of, well, I don't think I'm a particular show off. I suppose that there must be an extrovert side to me. Otherwise, I wouldn't do what I do. But I would say on the nature of, if shy is 0% and extrovert is 100, I would say I'm probably in 30 to 40.
And I think, if I've understood you right, is that what you get from broadcasting, particularly from the LBC show, is there's a connection and a meaning with your audience that
Yes.
feeds you in a kind of, this is probably too big, but in a kind of soulful way. Like it feels like it's important.
Well, I think it is important. Let me give you an example of that. During COVID, I broadcast 140 programs from my bedroom.
God.
You don't get much more intimate with people than that. And what you come to realize is the longer you're on the radio, you have this enormous group of hundreds of thousands of friends who you've never met, but they listen to you every evening. You are part of their life. They know, and they quote this back to me, they know that I drive an Audi. They know that I have 2 dogs. They know that I support West Ham. My partner always says, can you keep nothing private? But part of the bargain of doing speech radio is that you are very open with your audience. Sometimes I'm having a bad day, and I admit that on the radio. Oh, I'm going to be a bit grumpy tonight. I've had a bad day, so please forgive that. Now, that's in some way, some people think that's unprofessional, but it's not, because a lot of your listeners have had a bad day. And I'm quite known for emoting on my program. My mother and my sisters cry at anything, and I've inherited that, and I'm no longer embarrassed by it. I mean, I'll cry at Emmerdale, or even some sort of soppy advert makes the tears flow, which sometimes you don't want to happen. And it happens sometimes over really silly things. But other times, again, I'll give you an example. Do you remember the terrorist murder of Lee Rigby outside Woolwich Barracks in 2013? I was on air just after that happened. And so I spent the whole programme on it. And then 2 days later, the Ministry of Defence issued a statement about it all, flashed up on my screen. Now, normally I would then skim read it before I read it out to the audience, but I didn't this time, and I just read it out. And it got to the line, and Lee Rigby had 2 children. And I just went. I didn't cry. I just went silent, because I was trying to compose myself. And it was probably, I don't know, 5 seconds, but on radio, that sounds a lot longer than 5 seconds. So
it's very powerful.
It was powerful, but I was embarrassed by it, because there you're not doing an emotional phone in, you are reporting the news, and your job is not to get emotional. So at the end of the hour, I just said, can I just apologize for what happened there? That shouldn't have happened. And I just left it. And I have a screen in front of me which has all the live texts coming into the program. It went mad with people saying, please don't apologize. We were doing the same.
Nice.
And there's so many occasions when that sort of thing has happened. There was one occasion, though, when I did break down, and my producer said in my ear, did you do that on purpose? And I said, what kind of person do you think I am? I mean, I would never do it on purpose.
Performing monkey. I don't think manipulative I could. Monkey.
Well, I'm not an actor.
No.
But, well, actually, I say that, but I suppose there is a little bit of an act in doing speech radio, because, I mean, I'm not a shock jock, but there are occasions when you do sort of maybe become a little bit of an exaggerated version of yourself. Maybe your views tend to be a little bit more trenchant than they really are. But I will never go into an hour thinking, oh, I'm going to wind that person up. Like I never go into an interview thinking, I'm going to get you tonight. Because I just feel you're kind of letting the audience down if you think like
and
that.
it is manipulative.
Yes.
So the question I ask all my guests is, what is a particular challenge you have faced or are facing?
I would say over the last couple of years, health challenges. I think until I was about 50, I don't think I'd ever even been to see a GP. I was very healthy. And then as soon as I turned 60, it all went to pieces. And you realize that you're not indestructible. And I'm a diabetic. I was diagnosed in 2007, entirely my own fault. I have a terribly sweet tooth, and I do try my best, but I have no self-discipline. If I have one Jaffa cake, I eat the whole tube, etc., etc. However, I have got quite a bit better on that. But back in, when was it? 2022, I was
after
appearing,
COVID. I mean, COVID is probably bad for you from a...
Well, I had to... I was, I think, one of the first radio presenters to present from home because they agreed that as a diabetic, I was in a vulnerable group. And I think I started presenting from home on something like the 17th of March. Everybody else then followed suit. But in terms of, I mean, I went through the whole of the COVID epidemic without getting COVID until I think it was summer 2022. I went to a big posh party at a house in Gloucestershire. And I remember walking into the drinks reception, and it was like everybody was like really close up. And I said to my partner, if we don't get COVID after this, I'll be very surprised. We both did.
Horrible.
It was horrible. And then a month after that, I was at the Buxton Literary Festival in the Buxton Opera House. And the event had finished. I was chairing a panel, and I fell off the stage into the orchestra pit. A 12-foot drop.
Like Ian McKellen the other day.
Exactly. Well, it was funny. I did it. Then Dave Grohl did it. Then Stephen Fry did it. Then Ian McKellen did it. And I mean,
what the hell's going on?
I don't know. It's catching. I've always been a trendsetter. So that was a terrible thing.
Did you really hurt yourself?
I was actually very lucky because I landed on a cello, or a cello case. It was a 1708 cello worth £100,000. Let's put it this way. After that, it wasn't.
Oh, God.
But it broke my fall. I damaged both knees quite badly. I didn't break anything, which was a miracle. And had I landed at an angle, I wouldn't be speaking to you today because there was a step and my head would have gone straight onto the angle of the step. So I actually feel quite lucky. But then I also then developed problems with my eyes. I was driving up the M1 one day to another literary festival and suddenly realised I couldn't see out of my right eye, which is
that's to do with diabetes now, isn't it?
Exactly. So I've had to have lots of laser treatment, injections in my right eye. Now that's all more or less come right. But I now have to have reading glasses. I went for a year and a half when I wasn't actually able to read, which as a voracious reader was horrible. So again, you realise that you're in quite a vulnerable position.
And you realise your mortality now.
Exactly. And then last year, I'd been to the Foy Literary Festival. This is a theme here. It always happens when I go to literary festivals. I was rushing to get a train at Charing Cross, went up the tube escalator, and somehow at the top of it, I tripped. And to cut a long story short, I broke my hip.
Oh, shit.
I mean, it was horrible.
I'm
provoking
painful.
A lot of shits from you today.
Sorry.
So I was then off work for goodness knows how long.
2 months.
It was a long time. And then I discovered I had osteoporosis, which I thought only women got. My mother had it. And so I was diagnosed with that. So that was a bit of a blow. I actually
didn't know men got osteoporosis.
20% of cases are men.
So it's not to do with hormones, or is it to do with...
Well, apparently not, unless it's something I don't know about myself. And then this year's little issue was I had to have my gallbladder out because I was doubled up in pain. So that was another 7 weeks off work. But I had the operation at the beginning of September, and people said, oh, you'll feel like a new person after this. And I thought, yeah, okay. But I did. I felt the first show back on the radio, I felt as if I was sharper, just completely on it. All the interviews I did were really good. I enjoyed it in a way that I hadn't done for about a year. And I think what had happened is that I had a perforated gallbladder. It wasn't gallstones. and that the bile that builds up, it had been leaking out into my bloodstream. And it meant that for the last year, I just felt completely run down. Now, I put that down to age, nothing else, but it was clearly down to this. So I'm back, I'm fighting fit, and just waiting for the next disaster.
So what's been the cost psychologically, if we're thinking of how that's quite a catalogue of a broken hip, your gallbladder, diabetes, COVID?
I'm not somebody who easily gets depressed. I think with that catalogue of things, I easily could have become depressed. I suppose I'm very phlegmatic about it all. You just think, well, you're getting older, these things happen, more things like this happen. I hate having to be careful about doing anything. And so, like going downstairs, I've been having to hold a handrail, and that really does make me feel quite old. Less now because my balance seems to have come back. And that was mainly to do with the knees, I think. But it's a good question. It hasn't depressed me, but it's made me realize that there are some things now that I just can't do, that I just took for granted. Or like some friends said, oh, we're going skiing, would you like to come skiing? And I thought, well, I'd love to more, but I can't, because if you have osteoporosis, you can break any bone in your body very easily. My mother broke her leg while she was asleep in bed.
Oh my goodness.
And that has, because my father just didn't know what to do. I mean, who would know what to do? And that, bizarrely, the doctor said, brought on his diabetes, just the shock of it. I don't know how that works, but that's what the doctor said.
Your autonomic nervous system going haywire again.
And I mean, I'm not a hypochondriac, and I do have a bit of a Protestant work ethic, which means that when I'm not at work, even if I'm really ill, I feel incredibly guilty about it. I'm one of these people that if I have a really bad cold, I still go into work, which I know I shouldn't because you might infect other people. But I've always been like this. I mean, even if I had to have a day off at school.
Must have been your upbringing, no?
Well, I think it was, because my father was a farmer. He worked literally 18 hours.
Yeah.
And I mean, I never wanted to go into farming, but every job I've done, I've been the same. It's very rare that I would ever have a day off. I'd never take my full holiday allocation. So that there is something going on there in terms of just feeling guilty, I suppose. And I think it's also partly because though everyone looks at me and says, well, you're a workaholic, you're always doing something, I've always thought that I was an intrinsically lazy person.
But the two could be linked, no? So there could be this fear that I'm lazy, which would go to a belief, if I'm lazy, I'm not a good person. Yeah. So the behavior would be to compensate for that, to kind of overperform or overwork. And the other thing with working, and I don't know if this is true for you, it doesn't sound likely, is that often we use work as an anesthetic, like it is an addictive behavior to stop us feeling, so that we're so busy all the time that it stops us having to reflect and be with ourselves and be with the uncomfortable feelings that we need space to allow.
I've never thought about it in that way, but I do have quite an addictive personality. I don't think I'm
like
addicted
the Jaffa
to
cakes.
Work. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the other day, I don't know if you saw that story about Ed Sheeran saying that he didn't really want to be on the Do They Know It's Christmas song again. Well, the artist that persuaded him of that, a guy called Fuse ODG, I heard one of his songs and I thought, oh, I really like that. So, of course, what do? Not only do I download that song, I go and download everything he's ever done on the off chance that I might like the rest of it. Luckily, I did. But that's what I will do. I become slightly obsessed about something. I love lists. I edit these books where I get 50 or 60 people to write a chapter about a particular president or prime minister or dictator. And I love the challenge of doing the jigsaw, of getting the people and then allocating them to the right person. And when I get to the end of it and I have the complete list, I'm always a bit sad, really, because that means I've finished.
It's quite interesting, that, isn't it? I think what it's telling me is that there may be a part of you that feels a bit scrambled, and that by giving yourself a project or a compulsion, like looking at a particular artist, it gives you a sense of order, gives you a sense of control, a kind of cohesiveness, like I'm doing the jigsaw of this, and then that external jigsaw soothes an internal disjointedness. And where I go with that, and this again could be completely wrong, is you were quite late to come out. And my guess is, being gay as the son of a farmer, I wouldn't know what your parents were like about homosexuality, but there may have been a kind of a mismatch between who you felt you were and who you felt you should be.
I have thought about that in the past. I mean, I knew from a very early age that I was different. I don't think I would have necessarily thought, oh, I'm gay. I mean, I'm talking about like 6, 7, 8 years old. I knew I wasn't like the other boys, but it's difficult to articulate how I knew that.
Yeah, try. Can you remember?
Well, maybe it was partly because I had 2 sisters. And so I don't know if I can articulate it, because it was only really, I mean, in my early teenage years, I did know that I fancied boys. I had lots of girlfriends, though. That wasn't just to mask it. I mean, I did have feelings for them. I wasn't trying to lead them on, but it would always get to a certain point where I would basically end it because I didn't want it to go any further. And I had no physical relations at all until I was 28. And that was, I guess, because I didn't go looking for it. There was no opportunity that presented itself. And it's kind of what you've never had, you don't miss, I suppose.
But normally, can I just pause you there a moment? Because that's a very fast conclusion, which no therapist would let you get away with.
Go on then.
Well, I mean, we're kind of adolescents. We begin our kind of sexuality and sexual awareness and sexual drive. There's a libido, there are hormones that kind of push buttons in us that influence our behavior, that we start having sexual urges, sexual feelings for people, sexual fantasies. Boys, women, girls masturbate, then have sexual relations. I mean, the developmental phases and stages are different. So some are earlier and some are later. But I would say 28 is by quite a big chunk, maybe 7 or 8 years later than the far end of it. Well, so there's something else going on about you not. My interpretation would be that you blocked your sexuality because you feared the information it would give you.
I think part of it was that I wouldn't be able to explain it to my parents, to best friends who had, well, I'm not going to say they had no clue, because when I eventually did come out, they all said, well, we kind of knew anyway.
Including your mum and dad?
No. And that was where all my friends, because I slightly led this double life where in London, in my work life, I was out. Everyone knew. I don't think it was there was no shame attached to it at all, and there never has been. But I just knew my parents, and my parents were the most important thing in my life. And my mother was a very innocent woman in many ways. And I just knew that she would find it very difficult and upsetting. So I wanted to go into politics at a relatively early age, but I didn't, because I don't think I mean, we were talking mid to late 1980s, early 1990s here. You can't go into politics, and it was the same even then, unless you're willing to be open about things like that. And it was only when I was, I think, over 40, that I decided I did want to be an MP. Ludicrous logic in some ways, but I decided if I got through to the second round of a parliamentary selection contest in a constituency, that's when I would have to tell them. And that's exactly what happened. So this is what, 12, 13 years after my first gay experience. And I can remember driving up the M11 thinking, oh my God, how am I going to do this? And I'd been with my partner, who's still my partner.
Who's your husband now, no?
Yeah. Though bizarrely, I never use that word. Isn't that weird? I always say partner.
Okay.
We might come back to that. I don't know. But I didn't know how to do it. So I started, I can't remember how the conversation went, but I remember, because John had been to their house, he'd stayed there. I mean, obviously not sleeping in the same bed. But I knew that this would come as a bit of a shock, whereas everybody else thought they must know. And I remember saying to my mother, he's more than a friend. Because she'd said, well, we know he's your friend. I said, no, it's more than that. And then the penny dropped. And my father was always really good in a crisis, and he was very accepting. But I can still see this vacant look in my mother's eyes. And the next morning, or no, it's that same afternoon.
So the penny dropped and she kind of just shrank into herself. She kind of disappeared.
Yes, exactly.
And you felt her withdrawing from you, like she was in some way not wanting to be.
Which she didn't want to accept the reality. I mean, there had been a couple of occasions. I remember being in the car with her one day when I don't know where we were going, and whatever subject we were talking about, I was thinking, oh, well, you could actually tell her now, but I didn't. And I had told my older sister, well, she's younger than me, but the older of the two, I told her a few years before, because she was going through a sort of marriage crisis. And I just sort of blurted out, you've got problems. But I hadn't told my younger sister. And then I made the stupid error of telling her. And then I told her that I'd told the other one 5 years before, which really offended her.
Yeah.
Only understandably.
Yeah.
But that afternoon when I left, I remember getting in the car and saying to my young sister, well, I suppose that went about as well as it could. And she said, you have no idea. Why couldn't you have just left it be? And I said, because I couldn't risk them reading about it in the diary column of the Daily Telegraph. That's why. And then the next morning, I get a phone call from my sister saying to me, well, I've just been speaking to Mum and she told me that she wished she'd never woken up.
Oh, Iain.
And
so it's like a death.
To this day, I don't know why she had to tell me that. I mean, that's probably the most upsetting thing anybody's ever said to me in my whole life. I can remember exactly where we were. I can't remember what I said in response. Anyway.
But it's like telling you that you'd killed your mum, right?
Yeah. And I mean, nothing changed.
I can see it's in your body. I can see it's in your body. It's just like, oh, that really hurts.
It really did, because look, I know I do think this is a strength, but it's also a weakness in that I am a very emotional and sensitive person. Some would say that's because I'm a Cancerian, and things like that really get to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think they get to anyone.
Of course they do.
But
and it was intentional. I mean, your sister wanted...
5 or 6 years later, John and I did a civil partnership and my parents came, but I could just see that my mother would have been, she'd rather have been anywhere else in the world. And she and John always got on well. They still did, even after that. We never spoke about it again.
Is there anything...
That's what happens in families, I suppose.
It is. Was there anything you would want to have known from her that you wish you'd asked her?
I can't think of an immediate answer to that, because we always had quite a close relationship. She would confide in me things that she maybe wouldn't have told my sisters. We'd always have good conversations. I do think she died in 2012 in a very horrible way.
Oh.
And I think in those sort of last few years, I didn't see her as often as I should have done. Partly, I think, if I was to self-analyze, it would be because I kind of wanted her to be how she always had been. But she had 5 hip operations, 2 knee operations. She was fairly immobile, and the absolute devotion and love was still there. And looking back, I should have made a lot more of an effort, but too late now.
But at that moment, when you said to her, we're more than friends, there was a kind of tear that occurred inside you and inside her. And because it was so complex and she didn't have the emotional language, and you as her son, like always her child, were kind of injured by it, and particularly after what your sister said to you, it was like too hot and too painful to go to. But of course, in not discussing it again, you're both just left sitting with those wounds. And so the rest of it operated like you still loved her, she still loved you. But at the heart of you, there is this wound that you were both aware of, but didn't have the language or know how to face or how to heal or...
I think that's right. There was no meanness, there was no awkwardness in our future relationship. I mean, I used to do a lot of like Sky newspaper reviews, and as soon as I got in the car, she would be the one that I would ring, and she'd tell me how brilliant I'd been.
Yes, she was so proud of you. Yeah.
Well, she really was, and she kept saying, "I don't know how you know all these things." And I said, "Well, half the time I don't, but you just keep talking." And I will always remember that after the 2010 election, where I tried to get a seat but didn't, and then I came off the official Conservative Party candidates list.
Norman Lamb beat you, didn't he?
That was in 2005.
Oh, okay.
But I decided not to run again. So I told them I wanted to come off the candidates list. And I rang up my mum and told her, and she cheered. Now, you would hope in any normal society that would have been a moment of sadness for her, that her son, who always wanted to be a member of parliament, wasn't going to be. But it was in the aftermath of the expenses scandal. And she said, well, I'm really glad you're not going to do that, because you could have got caught up in that through no fault of your own. But I've often wondered if it was also the gay thing, where she was very pleased that my private life wouldn't be laid before the nation, because to her, it would have still been quite scandalous. And there were, I mean, I remember an article in The Observer written by their female political editor calling me, now, what expression did she use? The openly gay Conservative candidate. And I thought, you would never say... You would never say
heterosexual.
Yeah, and it was in the Observer. I mean, maybe if it's in the Mail, you
or
might
the Sun.
but oh my goodness, I did tackle her about it, and she promised never to do it again. But it's that sort of thing that if my mother had read that, she would have shuddered.
I mean, I think your mother was a woman of her time, and
yes.
You're almost the kind of living representation of being gay, being shameful and hidden and illegal, to kind of being whispered about, legal, but still shameful.
Yeah.
To, I hope, in most cases, not all, where we are now, where it is neither one thing or the other.
Well, I've always thought that had I been born in 1952 rather than 1962, first of all, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because I would have gone into farming, because that was just what the oldest son of any farmer, that's what they did, no questions asked. And secondly, I would have got married, probably had children, but furtively going to visit the local public toilet every so often, because that's what a lot of men did at that age.
Yeah.
And I remember doing a phone-in on this. How did you find out your husband was gay? And then, honestly, within 30 seconds, the switchboard was full of women coming on the programme saying, well, that's the situation either I was in or I'm in now. And there's a lot of it about. But, I mean, 10 or 20 years ago, there would have been a lot more of it about.
Yeah. It's really interesting, that. And how do you feel about not having had children?
I never, ever wanted children.
Phew. Not a deal.
My niece is always referred to me as Uncle Herod. So it's, no, I mean, look, better explain that. Not because I was nasty to them, but I've never, ever wanted children. There was only one time when, again, it was a result of a phone-in on LBC. It's quite in the early days, when we were doing a programme on fostering and adoption. And I remember saying during the programme, well, I've never wanted children. It's just as well, because I'd be a terrible father. And a lady rang in and she said, no, you wouldn't. You would be a fantastic father. Why don't you think about adopting? You're in a position to give a child a good home. So why wouldn't you want to do that? And I thought, well, there is a logic to that. I mean, I've never liked babies. I mean, once they can talk and get to 4, 5, 6, and you can like relate to them.
And they're funny.
So I came home that night, and I must have just turned 50, around that age. And my partner has always wanted children, but we agreed we weren't going to have them. And I said, well, maybe we should. And on the train home, I'd looked at the Kent County Council sort of adoption website. And so I said, well, maybe we should think about it. Oh, well, that's typical of you. Now it's too late. You want to do it. I said, well, I'm not sure I do want to do it, but I'm content to look into it. And that's where it finished. So, and I mean, I have our best friend, Daniel. He's 33. He's got 3 boys, a girl on the way. We have a lot to do with them. They come over for Christmas.
Yeah.
So I'm not completely anti-children, but I'm quite happy when they've left.
Yeah. I think it's so honest and refreshing to hear someone say they don't want children. I think there are probably quite a lot of people who have children who never really probably
Yeah.
wanted
Well,
them.
that would be my nightmare, because you can't hand them back. The moment the child's born, you've signed a contract,
Yeah,
and
you're done.
I mean, if you renege on that, that's really serious.
Yeah, yeah.
It must be hell for people who really didn't want children but have gone along with it for a quiet life.
Because it gives them the reverse, right?
Yeah.
To make sense of when you've kind of found your way of, at LBC, you found your place where you belong, where you have meaning, where you're successful. So tell me about the challenge of your imposter syndrome.
I think I've always had it because I've never been trained to do any job that I've had. Now, anyone who's been in work for 40 odd years, you're going to have the odd failure. I've certainly had the odd one, but I've always bounced back, because I think if you don't learn from your failures, you can just wallow in self-pity. And one in particular, in 1996, I half resigned and was half fired from the company that I'd co-founded with somebody. He had brought his wife into work in the company, who I'd always got really well with, but she decided that she was going to make a lot of changes. She wanted me to sack all of the people that worked to me. She thought they were incompetent. I didn't. And in the end, it was either her or me. And I'd worked that out quite early on. So I'd made preparations to go, and I'd started a business plan to open a political bookshop. And so I'd written my letter of resignation, and I went on holiday to America for a couple of weeks, and I was going to hand it to them the day after I got back, but they beat me to it. And so I had 6 months then of really not having any income at all, feeling a complete failure, going from driving a company Audi Cabriolet to a battered secondhand Sierra, on the verge of having to go and stack shelves in Tesco's for lack of any income. And I mean,
that's a real fall, isn't it?
Yeah, and I lived in a sort of lovely 2-bedroom riverside flat in Docklands, and I'd been with John for 18 months by then. He said, well, come live with me in Tunbridge Wells. So I did, and I've been here ever since. But the reason I talk about imposter syndrome, it's more my writing than anything else, in that whenever I send an article to the Daily Telegraph or to the newspaper, and I've written
a column.
Yeah, I've written for virtually every national newspaper there is. Whenever I press that send button, I always expect it to come back saying, this is rubbish, start again. Now, in 20 years, it never has come back. Oh, they might make the odd suggestion to add another paragraph, but I mean, everybody has that. But because I know that I can't write as well as Boris Johnson or Michael Gove or Jonathan Friedland or people like that, I've always had this thing about my writing.
What about at school? Did you have a teacher who criticised you, or did you have teachers who helped you believe in your skill?
I had some brilliant teachers. I went to a comprehensive school in Saffron Walden. My parents wanted me to go to a private school in Cambridge, and I went and did the entrance exams, which I passed, but I refused to go. I said, well, why would I go there? All my friends are going to the local school. So, and it was a good school. And there were several teachers there that, again, really influenced my life. And I mean, David Lewis, the head of languages, was certainly one of them. Bob Crossan, who still lives in Saffron Walden, head of history and economics. They were really important to me. And Bob Crossan in particular gave me a lot of confidence.
Their belief in you, they spotted you. Yeah.
But I never excelled in anything at school, really. I was always a sort of grade B student. And I remember when I decided to do German A-level, I hadn't done French O-level. So I started the French A-level class. Anyway, hated it because it's too much literature. And then I dropped down to do the O-level. And my sister was in the same class as me, which was,
that's
as you can
humiliating.
imagine, slightly weird. And she was always a grade A student. So whenever she got an A, I'd get a B. When she got an A plus, I'd get an A. I don't think there's one single occasion when I beat her. And I'm quite competitive, as you can tell.
But that's where it comes from, no?
Yeah, and I mean, the school gave me a lot, but I mean, for example, when I got involved in sort of politics at a reasonable level, I'd be in a group of, say, George Osborne, David Cameron, Ed Vaizey, Nick Bowles, And I would always be the one that wouldn't say much. I would listen and nod, because I think private school and certainly going to Oxbridge, it gives you that inner self-confidence. And even if you don't feel it, you exude it. And that's a real thing.
It is a thing. I've seen it.
And it was only really when I got to about 50 that I realised that they were no better than me.
Good.
And I don't have that anymore at all with anybody. If I meet a major celebrity, I don't think they're better than me.
Good.
I remember meeting Cliff Richard once. I mean, completely tongue-tied, but he was just such a hero. That's the only time that's ever happened. And then 15 years later, I end up on stage with him at the Hammersmith Apollo, interviewing him halfway through his concert for 3 nights. I mean, how great was that?
Yeah.
But in terms of the radio, I always knew, and it sounds very arrogant, but I always knew that I could do radio. I just needed someone to give me the opportunity. And I was standing in for Andrew Pearce on 5 Live, this is about 2000, 2001, did about 30 programmes with Fee Glover. And I thought I'd done really well. And I was like waiting for someone to come and get me. And they didn't. Now, looking back, I should have gone and touted myself around, but I didn't. And it was only in 2009 when my friend Yasmin Alibi-Brown, she is great, she's a very close friend of mine, but we disagree on everything, like where I'm right-wing, she's left-wing, and vice versa. And she said, oh, I'm going to do an audition at LBC. I said, oh, I want to do that. How can I do that? So she gave me the name of the guy that ran it. He knew of me through my political blog. And so we went in to do an audition, so 20 minutes answering fake phone calls, so the producers would pretend to be the callers. And it was a disaster. And I walked out of there thinking I'll never hear from them again. Because Yasmin is a brilliant pundit, but she couldn't do the sort of, well, I'm coming up after the news, we're going to be talking about X, Y, and Z. Here's the phone number, da-de-da. Anyway, 3 weeks later, they phoned me up and said, our presenter's ill. Can you come and do the show tonight? And I said, oh, with Yasmin. And they said, nope, just you. Which was a little awkward, but we're still good friends.
Good.
And that was the break I needed, because I could show them what I could do. So they then offered me a daily show, which I couldn't believe.
And you haven't left. In
the first 6 years, I won Radio Presenter of the Year twice.
That's amazing.
And that was a real validation. I suppose that did stop my imposter syndrome to an extent, because that you're selected for that by your peers. So I just thought, well, that is kind of what I needed, because I think I'm doing okay, but that showed me that I was.
I think what's interesting, and actually not that many people get the chance, is that there can be quite a fixed belief that one has about oneself that you get from school, like I am good at maths, or I am not good at maths, I'm a B student, I'm not an A student. And you take that version of yourself into your adult life, and you see the A students in your version was Gove or Johnson or Cameron or George Osborne. But then when you get your own validation, like your own Oxbridge, which is with the Radio Presenter of the Year twice, it's like the past then updates. You kind of update your sense of yourself, and that early version can kind of disappear. And I think that's really interesting.
I think also, as you get older, you start to know yourself. I know that sounds trite, but I don't think I completely understood myself until I was about 50. You find out what you're good at, you find out what you're not good at, and that's just as important.
It is, yeah.
And I've always thought of myself as quite a funny person. But I remember being invited to do the Irish version of Have I Got News for You? So I had to go to Dublin. It was in front of a
live
audience with 4 Irish comedians and an English Tory. What could possibly go wrong? And I found out that night that I wasn't as funny as I think I am. And I can be funny spontaneously, but they'd had 4 days to write their scripted jokes. I didn't even know what the subjects were until I walked into the theatre.
Yeah.
And I can't, it's like if you said to me now, go on then, tell me a funny joke.
You can't do it on demand.
No. It's not going to work. So I did learn, well, stick to what you're good at. I've never been invited on the UK version of Have I Got News for You? And I probably would say yes if they did, but I would go into it very nervous, because that they record like 2 hours and show 30 minutes, and it's always to show the 30 minutes that Paul Merton and Ian Hislop are really funny, and the guests often don't really get a look in.
Yeah.
So you have to learn these things.
Yeah. Well, Iain, thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast and for being so open. I think for me, it's been a really valuable, meaningful conversation.
Well, for me too. There's no point in doing these things if you're not going to be honest. And I hope my partner never listens to it because I can't believe you told her that.
Well,
but there we go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, Emily and Sophie. We are going to talk about Iain Dale. The thing that strikes me most, that was the most insightful part of the conversation, was him communicating to his parents, in particular his mother, about being gay and how it reflected a particular social time that we don't sort of hear about very much now. And I thought that was very revealing.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting with how much sort of empathy and compassion he spoke about that conversation. And it, you know, in some ways he just sort of accepted her reaction. And it also felt really deeply sad to listen to, because if you sort of think about it, we're all born with a real primal need to be loved for who we are by the people who brought us into the world, particularly. And so to have the experience, which, you know, he's definitely not alone in this experience of saying, like, this is who I am. And for that to really not be accepted, and not only not be accepted, to then have somebody else say, actually, this is causing your parents so much pain that they don't want to be alive. I don't know how you manage that. And whatever it is that you've kind of revealed, whether it's to do with your sexuality or all the many different ways that we live our lives, or just who we are as people, and that kind of rejection for just being who you are, that to me felt really unbearable, even though Iain wore it very lightly.
Yes, I was sort of struck by how he seemed to still be able to really receive love and affirmation and attention from his mum after the event. You know, for many of us, those kind of ruptures, they can take over the relationship in a total way, where we no longer can really give and receive love and care because the hurt is so big and so unresolved. There's actually
understandably so, right?
Absolutely understandably so. So it was sort of striking, like you said, the sort of warmth, and that when he talked about how his mum rang up after a show and said how brilliant he was, and that there was mutual, and also for her, obviously there was this thing that she was really struggling to come to terms with her son, and yet loved him in all these other ways. It didn't wipe him out for her. It's obviously people who've had experiences where their parents have rejected them and don't want them part of their family in a kind of total way, which is just an interesting story in that way, that often we hear the extremes, and this is, yeah.
I think sometimes we compartmentalize. We can just be like, okay, we're just not going to talk about that ever again. Old school.
I mean, I think what was protective, and I think sort of pulling away from Iain and looking at this from a kind of meta perspective. Is that the right word? Meta?
I don't know, 'cause I don't know what you're going to say. Like, are you zooming out?
I'm zooming out. That having his perfect childhood, which I obviously questioned and found kind of hard, you know, because it's the one thing we say childhood never is. But there was a lot of unconditional, secure attachment and love. And there was a depth of memory and experience within him, which, although that the conversation with his sister was probably the most painful of his life, when she said, you know, his mother didn't want to wake up, it did give him the resilience to be able to continue his relationship with his mother. And what I was thinking from a general perspective, when there is enough love, it is extraordinary what families can overcome, and choosing to find ways, their own ways of dealing with what they would otherwise find impossible. And in theirs, it was to not talk about it. And we have lots of different defenses, don't we, within families? One of the most common in families is not to talk about things. And we say as a triad, you need to talk, but sometimes maybe not talking and just having the relationship you have is a valid response.
I think if it's sort of good enough on both ends, then it's a valid enough response. And when there's still connection that can happen, and sometimes when there's this really big thing nobody can talk about because you're in such different places about it, it's really hard to find connection. Obviously, that wasn't the case for Iain. And I think, yeah, like the sort of messiness or the good enoughness of, okay, my parent is from this certain generation with her own or his own experience and cultural, societal, whatever it is. They're probably not going to change now. And therefore I have a choice. I can either kind of accept where they are, or I can try and get them to change. Sometimes the likelihood of somebody changing, it's not impossible, but it can be
Small.
unlikely. And then you kind of have a choice of what you want to do with that.
I also think, and I'd be interested if you agree, but it's also kind of a universal journey with parents of growing up almost. There's a sort of desire to have a perfect parent who loves you in every way that you
As
are.
you did, darling.
As obviously we had. And then there is a sort of, I don't know, I suppose a sort of growing up process where you have to accept that they love you in the way that they love you, that your childhood was the way that it was, that it can't change, that where are the rooms for negotiation and where are the places that you need acceptance. There isn't anything, whether it can't change because it was the past or because it's not realistic in the relationship or the person that the other person are or who you are. Because I think we can sort of fight all our lives wanting to have something that just isn't ever going to be there in that particular relationship, and that can make us so deeply unhappy. But that's not the same as saying giving up. It's a sort of negotiation, isn't it? Internally and sometimes between you and the other person.
And where I go with that, Soph, is that your core relationship with your parents really matters. So facing the reality as it is, rather than kind of having a stand and a fixed position where you can maintain that love and connection with all of its imperfection, is a pretty sound response.
And I think it's true of couples too. What is it that your partner is able to give you and what is not really, either you can stay with the person and come to some kind of acceptance of what's possible between you and this is what you could work on. And sometimes it's also accepting that they're probably never going to be the person who's going to be good at
tick all the boxes.
Doing this type of thing with you. You need to go do it with someone else.
I mean, I think, of course, in all relationships, nobody's going to meet every need or be exactly who you want them to be. But I think there is quite a fundamental difference between that and sort of revealing something that is really fundamental to who you are and your own identity and having that rejected. To me, those feel quite different things. This is my identity. This is sort of who I am. Versus, okay, I'm with somebody who maybe isn't able to meet this particular need or is never going to react in exactly the way that I would want them to react. And one feels much more sort of about a relationship, and one feels like, for some people, a really fundamental part of self.
Yes, but in some senses, I agree. I really agree that they're different, but that to some extent, there's the same process of having to work out how to respond to that for yourself and how you want then that relationship to be. There's a sort of accommodation of, or not. You can choose to no longer have a relationship with that person, but we can't control the other, can we? We can't make them be or feel, even if it's profoundly wounding, that they do feel what they feel.
And can I ask you both a question about sexuality and sexual preferences and identity? Do you feel there's still a lot of work to be done societally, or do you feel like we've come a long way in accepting people for who they are, as a core identity?
I think we've come a long way in some areas. I think on the whole, homosexuality is much more accepted, obviously depending on where you're born, which country. But talking about UK specifically, I think generally
Yeah, I mean,
we're
it's
better.
illegal in quite a lot of countries. So,
Exactly. So sort of taking a UK perspective, I think it's still like a very politicized topic. In fact, probably now more than ever, when we think about the sort of polarity of the transgender debate, when I think about lots of young people that I see who are really interested in gender as part of identity and sexuality as part of their identity, and how I think confused and lost and somewhat bemused like their parents often are. And so I think there is like a shift in terms of the debate on gender and identity and sexuality that is being driven by the younger generation that will, I think, eventually sort of even out. But right now is pretty politicized and pretty polarized and actually quite difficult to have just conversations about.
It's interesting.
I was sort of conscious that three heterosexual women.
Yes, you're very specific.
That our sort of experience comes maybe through a friend. I was thinking how there's still this feeling of homophobia around men coming together and talking and connecting, like, oh, men coming together, it's also obviously their own cars at the start.
We're not gay.
We're not gay. Exactly.
Promise.
We're not gay. We're just going to talk about our feelings.
Yeah. And so that would be a terrible thing if they were all gay. Like this is I mean, not the intention, I'm sure, of this person, but like the underlying.
And I don't think they even would have thought that was some of the driver behind the kind of nervous joke that sort of popped out. But I guess there's overt and there's sort of implicit, isn't there, with these kind of issues that it's still very sort of present in little ways like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
About what a man or a woman should or shouldn't be.
I thought, and this is a tangent, so I don't know if you have anything.
I like tangents.
Yeah. I really liked the way that you kept on trying to make like deep psychological insights, and it was like, no, it wasn't really that. And it made me think like the therapist's perspective is not always the same as the individual's perspective, and that we sometimes. Like maybe we think that we've got it really sort of deeper, right? And actually no. Sometimes my husband and I sometimes we get into debates. Well, I have to say this doesn't reflect well on me because I sound incredibly annoying. Where I'll sort of like make connections about why he might have like a really big reaction to something, and I'll like relate it to his childhood or like some sort of deep like subconscious something, and he's like, no, it's not that deep. I just don't want to do it. Yeah, I just don't want to do it. I just don't like that person, or I just don't feel like it. Like not everything has like some sort of subconscious driver behind it. Sometimes things are just things
As they are.
Yeah,
A rose is a rose.
I know. I'm sneakily thinking. I know you.
I'm right.
You think that? Yes, darling.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. Yeah.
I was also thinking about that bit, you touched on imposter syndrome at the end and kind of the validation that Iain got
From the prize.
It's from the prize. And that kind of, again, it's a kind of often therapy thing to say, or it's in sort of general psycho babble chat that's out there, that you need to love yourself before anyone can love you, that external validation isn't important, that it's really about how you feel about you, or within person-centered theory, what we call sort of conditions of worth. We need to actually have our own sort of unconditional love for ourselves rather than always trying to live up to what we need to be in order to believe that we can be loved. And obviously there's a lot of truth in that. That's why it's out there and it's become part of sort of cultural dialogue about what it means to have good relationships and be happy. But it also feels like it can oversimplify the importance of external validation, and that actually that we do all have a real big drive to be seen and to be valued by the people around us. I guess as
in his case, it was that his peers valued him. That was
was about to say is who to be seen. I think that's one of the things of social media, isn't it? It's an illusion of being seen, but the people that really can be an illusion. I'm not saying that's a universal thing, but to be seen by the people that really know you and love you is profound. But there can also be traps of thinking you're being seen and actually in that sort of possible social media or putting on fronts at work that getting validated, and then the feeling inside being like, yes, but if you really knew me, ...
You wouldn't.
you wouldn't. And it's just a complicated dance, isn't it? I'm not being very articulate, but I think we write off the external validation piece as though we're not supposed to need it.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, there's no doubt in my experience in myself, by writing my books and stuff, I've got more confidence as a therapist. So I really appreciate Iain for coming on the podcast. And he came through Jane Garvey because he used to work with her, and he listened to my conversation with her and suggested that she'd come on. Yeah, so we got in touch. And so that was really lovely too. I hope everybody who listens enjoyed it and got something from it. Thank you very much.